Okay, just a little video to help you with social influence. So, three types of conformity. So, I'm going to fly through these because they're pretty easy. So, conformity is changing your beliefs and/or behaviour in response to the pressure from a group. Kelman identifies three types. Internalization is the strongest and most long term, and people do it because they genuinely believe the group are correct, and that's usually because of the credibility of the group. Secondly, compliance. So this is short term, weakest, only happens on a public level. They privately disagree. They only conform due to the desire to fit in and not experience social disapproval. Identification is to do with a specific role that someone has in society or membership to a certain group. It's more of an official group rather than like a friendship group. So things like being part of a sports team or a prefect, that kind of thing. And again, it's short term, you only do it whilst you're in that social role, and you may still privately disagree. Deutsch and Gerard put forward two different explanations. So, normative social influence is based on the assumption that people have a desire to fit in, to be liked, they don't want to experience social rejection. So, this one is very similar to the idea of compliance. And then informational social influence, this one is the idea that individuals have a desire to be correct, and that's closely associated with internalization because you genuinely accept that the person or the group that are influencing you are correct, and that's why you change your behavior or attitudes. Both of the explanations have supporting evidence. So Lincoln Back provides supporting evidence for normative. So youths were told that their friends did not smoke and therefore they were less likely to start smoking because their friends didn't, demonstrating the desire to fit in. So that provides supporting evidence, adding credibility to the explanation. McGee and Tevam found that there are individual differences. Some people are affiliators, so they have a stronger need to experience approval from others. So, therefore, the explanation can't be applied universally because some people are more likely than others to conform. Same with informational social influence. There's supporting evidence, which comes from Asher's task difficulty variable, provides credibility. However, there are individual differences. Engineering students were less likely to be influenced because they had more confidence in their own ability. So, therefore, the explanation cannot be applied universally. And then, if there was a situation where there was a 16 marker and you needed a second deco for either of them, you can use Ash's research again. The difference between these 2 points is this one's about the evidence from the task difficulty variable. This one is about the follow-up interviews with the participants when Ash asked them why they conformed. So here you can say that the participants explained that they conformed due to, and then either to be correct or to fit in. And then if you've made that evaluation point, you can criticise it by saying that those explanations only explain why they conformed in the lab setting on a task that lacked mundane realism, because you're rarely asked to measure line lengths in a group setting. So those explanations don't necessarily transfer to real life situations where people are asked to conform. Key study. So Asher's study, again, very easy, so I'm not going to massively go into detail, but hypothesised that participants would change their answer in response to group pressure. 50 American males, it was a lab experiment. The participants were deceived. They had to believe that it was something other than conformity, or the demand characteristics would affect the results. So they believed it was a vision test. 7 Confederates, 1 real participant, measuring line lengths. Critical trials were the ones that were being measured, so where the Confederates were giving an incorrect answer. They didn't give an incorrect answer every single time to kind of stop the participant from clocking on that it was all a joke. And the real participant was always placed at the end. Also, this is a key point, there was a control group to ensure that it was actually possible to do the task. So the control group had to do it without any Confederates there to check that the participants would get the correct answer otherwise. That was to improve the internal validity of the experiment, because they wanted to check that the key reason they were giving an incorrect answer was due to the group pressure, the IV, rather than it actually just being their incompetence, like actual inability to measure the line lengths. So it reduced that extraneous variable of ability to complete the task. Findings: 75% of the participants went along at least once, and the kind of frequency of conformity was 1/3 of the time. So that's about the number of the actual participants. So out of the 50, 75% conformed at least once, and then the regularity of the conformity was 1/3 of the time. He proved his hypothesis correct. People do conform to group pressure, and then you can use normative and informational explanations to explain why that happened. So if there's ever a question that asks you to explain any of the variables or any of the reasons why they conformed, you can use those explanations. The key variables, so group size had a significant impact when it increased from 2 to 3, so the conformity levels doubled, having 3 Confederates as opposed to 2, but then it didn't really increase much more than that. Task difficulty, the conformity levels increased when the task became more difficult, so yeah, basically supporting this idea of informational influence, you looked to others for the answer if you didn't know it, or if it was less clear. Unanimity, so this is the idea that the group had consensus, they all gave the same answer. If the unanimity was broken at any point, even if they gave another incorrect answer, their conformity levels significantly dropped. So this idea that if you have an ally, another dissenter, then you can kind of go along with the correct answer, even if they don't say the same as you. Discussion points about ASH, so generalizability, this idea of lacking temporal validity. So due to the conformity levels being very high on a cultural level at that time, the findings may not apply to current society. So that means it lacks temporal validity. It doesn't necessarily lack historical validity. So historical validity is if it explains that time period. So Asher's study could explain that time period accurately. So it doesn't lack historical validity, but it may lack temporal because it might not be able to explain now. Bond and Smith also talk about it lacking generalizability to collectivist cultures. It also could lack generalizability to females because it was an androcentric or male sample. So essentially, it's got very limited generalizability. Dispositional factors, so this idea of affiliators and engineering students having more confidence in their ability, tells us that it's not just the kind of situational context of the group. There are dispositional factors that kind of affect the extent to which individuals conform, so therefore the explanations cannot be universally applied to all people. Does it have validity? So it's got high levels of internal validity, so you can give the example of them removing the extraneous variable of ability to complete the test by having a control group. You could also say it was highly controlled, allowing the replications to be carried out, and they could manipulate one specific variable. to test the impact of it. So, for example, they could carry out the experiment in the exact same way, the same number of confederates, the same trials, etc., but slightly change the line lengths, and therefore any change in responses was due to the task difficulty because all of the other variables were measured in the same way. All of the other conditions were standardized. However, it lacks ecological validity as it was conducted in a lab setting, and also the task lacked mundane realism and specify it was measuring line length. This does not reflect a real life activity, so therefore it cannot explain why individuals or the rates of conformity outside of the lab setting. And be specific, don't just write this out. You need to say conformity outside of this experiment. You need to say measuring line lengths would mean that it lacks mundane realism. Okay, moving on to Zimbardo. So remember, Zimbardo is about conformity. This has absolutely nothing to do with obedience, and some people, I think, some people get confused by that. So just make sure this has nothing to do with obedience. It's all about conformity. So this was the reason he wanted to do this was because at the time there was lots of talk about lots of I can't remember the word, inquiry into why there was so much violence happening in prisons. And Zimbardo wanted to challenge this idea that there was something fundamentally evil about the types of people in prisons. He wanted to see whether people would act that way even if they had no violent tendencies ever due to the situation. So he was putting forward the situational hypothesis, which was the idea that it was the context, the environmental situation that people were put in that was causing their behaviour rather than their individual disposition, so their personality that caused them to act that way. So mock prison environment, volunteer sample. He psychologically screened for antisocial and criminal tendencies and removed any participants who he believed were naturally violent. And that allowed him to test the situational hypothesis. If he'd have had people in the experiment that were naturally violent and they acted violent in the experiment, that doesn't prove the situational hypothesis because they were already violent, so it could have been their disposition. By having non-violent people that acted in a violent way does prove the situational hypothesis because the variable that's causing the violence must be the situation if they weren't violent in their normal lives. Procedure, I mean, that's fine, you can just read that, there's nothing difficult there. Conclusions, so if you're asked to explain the conclusions, say situational hypothesis, so the environmental context is what's causing the violence, what's causing the behaviour. This is because of the process of identification, so they were specifically acting that way because they thought their role required those behaviours. And this happened because they were dehumanized and de-individuated. So they're dehumanized because they weren't seeing themselves as their kind of human individual self or the people that they were behaving in that way towards. So the idea that they had an ID number, not a name, the idea that they couldn't make eye contact with each other, the idea that they were wearing kind of the sort of feminized gown that they had to wear that made them all the same, resulted in them losing their individual identity, so therefore they just conformed to their role as guard or as prisoner. And then just a little quote from Zimbardo: if you put good apples in a bad situation, you'll get bad apples. Are his findings valid? So challenging this idea, no, because demand characteristics, they were acting up to media stereotypes, so they weren't behaving in that way because of the setting. but then it actually can be applied to real life situations because it's happened in real life situations. So therefore, you could argue that they do have external validity because they can be used to explain atrocities that have happened globally. So ultimately, they do have external validity and can be applied and can contribute to our understanding of kind of real life situations. And then this idea of, is it situational or is it dispositional? You can say he removed or, significantly reduced the dispositional factors. So it's likely that the situational hypothesis does have space validity. That's what is being measured there. However, Fromm is saying that there were individual differences in how participants conformed. Only a third were brutal in terms of the guards, a third were more fair, a third were actually trying to help them. So you could argue that Zimbardo exaggerated the extent to which the situation influenced the participants, and their disposition does still play a key role. Other points you could make are about males. Androcentric sample can't necessarily be applied to females, can't explain female prisons as well. It's another important point. And also the Riker and Haslam BBC attempt to replicate the study, and they failed. So you could argue that Zimbardo's hypothesis had been falsified, like it didn't actually work in the replication of the study. Okay, section 2. So this is about obedience. So Milgram is your key study here. So again, this idea of situational versus dispositional. When at the kind of time when Milgram was doing his research, people were explaining the Holocaust as something that had happened due to the disposition of German people. So it had been hypothesized that this nation of people had a more obedient disposition than other countries, and therefore the argument was that the Holocaust wouldn't have happened in a different nation, and that's what Milgram set out to test. So his hypothesis was Germans are different, and he therefore wanted to test the obedience levels of American people to see whether they would go against their morals in order to be obedient, and then that would allow a kind of contribution to this discussion about whether people were dispositionally obedient or whether it was the situational context that happened at the time. So 40 American males at Yale University, and it was a volunteer sample. Procedure, I'm not going to go through that because it's very easy. Key thing here, just remember that the prods that we used were this idea of like the binding factor, so the thing that kept the participants in the agentic state, which we'll come on to in a minute. But the prods were you must go on, the experiment requires you to go on, etc. 100% of participants continued up to 300, 65% went up to 450. The conclusions: Germans are not different. Most people will go against their morals to obey an authority figure, supporting the situational hypothesis. He also looked at the different variables affecting obedience. So he tested location by repeating it in a rundown office, and the obedience rates dropped to 48%. He replicated it with different conditions regarding proximity. So the original, the learner and the teacher were in separate rooms. When they repeated it in the same room, obedience dropped to 40%. When the teacher had to force the learner's hand onto the electric plate, it dropped to 30%. When the experimenter gave the orders by the phone, it dropped to 20%. Uniform. dropped to 20% when he replicated the study in ordinary clothes. So that single variable of uniform is arguably the most significant from these findings. Affected obedience. So are situational explanations stronger than dispositional? So Miranda repeated it in France and Spain. Berger replicated it 50 years later. They found almost identical results. So if there are lots of studies being replicated to find the same or similar findings, then this suggests their credibility. Also, if people in different countries in different time periods are acting the same way, it suggests that it's the situation that's causing them to act in that way, providing support for the situational hypothesis, because the commonality is the situation. Another point you can make there is the idea that it was a lab experiment that was able to be replicated. So having a standardized procedure, and also another strength is that by having a standardized procedure, they could manipulate one variable. So the same prods were used, the same location was used, the same setup, the same word pairs could all be used, but the experimenter could be wearing a different outfit, like the uniform changed, and then if the obedience rate significantly dropped, then the key difference was uniform. So therefore, there's kind of internal validity in terms of manipulating that one specific variable. So you could argue that the difference is due to that IV of uniform rather than any other factors, because they were able to maintain the same conditions. And then here we've got the critique saying that actually dispositional factors are significant because 35% of the participants were able to resist authority. And then you could use locus of control or authoritarian personality to explain that. And then in your overall, you could say like the majority of participants were obeying, so it's undeniable that situational factors have more of an influence, but we cannot disregard the significance of disposition. Are they valid? So Orne and Holland said some only obeyed because they knew the electric shocks were fake, so that means they were affected by domain characteristics, so it wasn't measuring what they intended to, so it lacks face validity. So they weren't actually measuring obedience due to that factor. You could then actually challenge that with Sheridan and King, so the idea that they repeated the study on dogs where they were obviously receiving a real electric shock because you can't tell a dog to act, and participants still obeyed. So therefore that counter argues against this point, because obviously no domain characteristics were at play there. Also, you could say that it's happened in a real life setting. So Hoeflin has argued that it can be replicated in a hospital, and when he did it in a hospital, the nurses all obeyed the doctor, and that shows that, again, domain characteristics weren't at play, so there's external validity. It can be applied to a real life setting. Also, you could be asked a more specific question about an individual variable, and it may ask you to kind of consider the significance of that variable. So actually, we'll come back to that in a second. So you could be asked to discuss how significant these three variables are, but you need to use some of the studies here, so we'll do this part first. So the two explanations that Milgram used to explain the findings of his study are agentic state and legitimacy of authority. So agentic state is the idea that people have two states of mind, the autonomous and the agentic. Autonomous is the idea of independence, and taking personal responsibility for your actions, making conscious choices about them. Agentic state is following the orders of the authority figure and believing that you're acting on their behalf rather than making your own independent choices. Participants experienced an agentic shift in Milgram's study as they were told the experimenter had full responsibility, so they just viewed themselves as following the orders. Milgram referred to the prods that were used, so the experiment requires you to go on, as an example of a binding factor, so something that keeps you within that agentic state. Is there evidence to support this explanation? So Blash and Smith students were asked to watch the experiment, and they were asked who was responsible for the electric shocks, and they all said it was the experimenter. So the idea that we as a society perceive authority figures as the people that should be held accountable for the actions rather than the people that followed their orders. But then we've got the idea that not everybody experiences an agentic shift. 35% were able to go back into an autonomous state after the 300 volts. So therefore, kind of dispositional factors played a role. Not everybody obeys. Also, you could argue that this explanation underestimates free will. So Bandura is saying it does underestimate free will. So it's a criticism of the explanation. So it's saying that not everybody passively accepts authority. They find a way to justify their behaviour and they can morally disengage. So they, in this case, the participants could have thought, oh, I need to do this because this is a study about learning, and if the participants are receiving punishment for not learning their word pairs, then maybe this will kind of help develop new ways to improve learning strategies or learning techniques. So they could have justified to themselves that there was like a greater good, a greater purpose as to why they should continue. So therefore they weren't just passively accepting what the authority figure was telling them to do, they actually justified it in their own head. So it's a weakness of the explanation because it's oversimplifying quite a complex cognitive process that's happening for participants to decide whether they should or shouldn't obey an authority figure. Then the Nuremberg defence is a real life example which relies on the assumption that people do lack free will. So when individuals were in the Nuremberg trials, which is here, they were saying we were only following orders. So it's the idea that individuals don't believe they actually have free will. So whether they do or not is kind of not the issue. It's that people feel that they didn't have the capacity to exercise free will in that situation. So there's space validity to that argument. And then as your overall, you could say that there's kind of, could you say, but yeah, maybe say it's like a more complex process than the explanation accounts for. You could say that maybe there are situations where more thought goes into obedience than others. So it may be that in situations where the authority figure is asking someone to do something which is against their morals, more moral justification needs to go into it than others. Or just a simple overall could be overall the explanation oversimplifies the complex process of deciding whether to obey an authority figure. Legitimacy of authority. So a legitimate authority figure is associated with an institution, with a uniform, a high position in the hierarchy, sometimes a position of social control, so the ability to give out sanctions, but they're not obeying because of the sanctions. So it's not like coercion, they're not making them obey, but it's the idea that you perceive them as more credible if they have that capacity. So whether they're going to threaten it or not, you're still going to obey them. Evidence to support it. So Bickman gave 3 different actors the task of asking people to pick up some litter. People were more likely to obey the security guard, then the milkman, and then very few obeyed the man in normal clothes. Further support comes from Hofflin, the one in the hospital setting. Nurses view the doctor as the legitimate authority figure. So yes, there is evidence to support the explanation. So overall, there is a wealth of support for this explanation. And then we've got the situational versus dispositional again. So supporting evidence for legitimacy of authority can be the location and uniform variable in Milgram's study. And then your criticism is that despite the original experiment being conducted in a prestigious location and the authority figure wearing a uniform, 35% still resisted. So therefore, even when there is a legitimate authority figure, people don't always obey them. So therefore, there must be some kind of dispositional factor that can explain why not everybody would obey in a kind of homogenous way. So just going back to the different variables, so you would need support for each one and criticism. So you've got location, you've got uniform, and you've got proximity. So support for location. So in the question, obviously, you might have already used Milgram's study in your outline. So the points here would be not using that, so you need other things. So support for location comes from Bickman. No, sorry, not Bickman. Hofflin, the hospital one. Support for uniform comes from Bickman. Support for proximity, you can use agentic stay and binding factors. So the proximity is an example of something that would help keep them in an agentic state. So it's a binding factor. And then the criticism of location is that it was the kind of least significant in terms of the variables. So the obedience rates were still 48% in the rundown office. So really, there's not like a huge difference in those statistics. So really, location didn't play a great role because they haven't reduced that much. That's still a very high rate of obedience in the non-prestigious location. So it's not that significant. So then that means dispositional or alternative variables must play a greater role. And then this one, obviously, uniform is the most significant. It dropped all the way to 20, but you could say that 20% were still obedient to a man in ordinary clothes. So therefore, are the variables. And then again, you can say it could be dispositional factors. And then the criticism for proximity, you can use Hofflin, and you can say that the doctors gave the orders over the phone and the nurses still obeyed. So they don't need to be in close proximity in order to obey in a real life setting. So therefore, it may not be as significant as Milgram first suggested. There we go. Okay, dispositional explanations of obedience. So the authoritarian personality. So this is the idea, and just be careful, it's not saying that this is a natural thing in terms of you're not born this way, it's not biological, but it's the idea that it's become part of your disposition. So it's part of an individual's personality, but that can have developed during their childhood. But it's the idea that your disposition is how you would how you would act in all situations. Whereas if it was situational, it's the idea that your personality is irrelevant. It's the situational that's the situation that's the most significant factor. So just be careful when you say dispositional. Don't say biological or natural. It's not that. It's just the individual's personality that's kind of set in all situations. So authoritarian personalities, the key idea is that they strictly follow hierarchy. So they have high levels of respect for people in positions of authority, but they are very status driven and will kind of discriminate or be prejudiced towards or violent against those below them in the hierarchy. And then just learn a couple of those specific traits. So Adorno aimed to identify a relationship between the specific personality type and obedience levels. So he identified certain traits as authoritarian and then designed a questionnaire to measure it. And he found from his study that there was a positive correlation between this authoritarian personality type and prejudice. The different explanations for why it develops. So the ego defense mechanisms. So children who were brought up in a very strict environment were unable to take their anger out on their parents. So they had to displace it onto a lower status target. So displacement is the ego defense mechanism, and they're displacing their anger from towards people above them in the hierarchy towards people below them. So they're moving it from the people above onto the people below because the people below are a easier target. So then you could use that in the context of Nazi Germany, that anger was towards people above them in the hierarchy, or long-term anger that they'd kind of carried from their childhood. They then had an outlet, which was to take it out on the people below them in the constructed hierarchy at that time of the people that were being abused in the system. The tripartite personality. So the authoritarian personality has an overactive id. So that means they have intense levels of desires and they feel ashamed about that. So their pleasure principle is highly active and they're very embarrassed about that. So they compensate by having a strong superego. So if you've got an overactive superego, that means that you're very obedient, you're going to follow the rules of society and be very sort of disciplined and strict in those senses. So as a result of having a strong superego, they follow orders, they follow the rules of society, and also they can project their insecurities onto people below them because they want to feel superior and they don't want to feel this embarrassment about their overactive id. So So, can dispositional theories explain obedience better than situational ones? Milgram's participants completed the F scale. There was a positive correlation between the fully obedient and those with high levels of authoritarian personality. So that provides support and evidence, provides credibility. Duckett, so it's difficult to use a dispositional theory to explain obedience of a whole nation. So the idea it's unlikely that a whole population of people could have had the same personality type. So when you look at those specific explanations as to how the authoritarian personality develops, it's unlikely that literally the millions of people that were involved in the Holocaust or have been involved in these kind of atrocities can have the same personality type. So it's not a particularly generalizable explanation. So therefore, we can't discount the influence of situational factors. Does the scale have face validity? So as a measurement, is it appropriate? So the comedy of methodological errors, so they were all worded in the same direction. So if you keep saying like you strongly agree, etc., then you're likely to have an authoritarian personality. You could argue as well in terms of this, it also measured their political views rather than their personality type. So again, lacks face validity, acquiescence bias, because they were all worded in the same direction. Zilmer, so the soldiers at the Nuremberg trials did not score highly on the F scale, so that's quite a significant issue. So it doesn't have face validity, it can't be measuring what it's intended to measure if the people that were literally being prosecuted for their war crimes were not scoring highly on this scale. So ultimately, it doesn't have face validity, so therefore it's definitely not a valid measurement. So making us question how useful it is as an explanation. Okay, on to the other booklet. And then if you do get a specific question about either situational or dispositional explanations, I would always say use the opposing explanation as one of your evaluation points and make it clear that that's a debate. Make it clear that you've defined in your outline what it means by situational, what it means by dispositional. Okay, explanations of resistance. So this is when people can resist or reject the orders of an authority figure, or it could also apply to conformity, so why somebody doesn't go along with the group pressure. So firstly, we've got social support. So this is the idea that if there's another dissenter that breaks the unanimity, individuals feel that they have an ally, so they can resist too. Evidence to support it comes from the unanimity variable in Asher's study. People were much less likely to conform, so only 5% conformed if there was a dissenter. And obviously just read the question. If the question's about resistance to conformity, you would use Ash. If the question's about resistance to authority and obedience levels, then you need to refer to Milgram. So make sure that you've identified, are they talking about conformity or obedience, and use the relevant supporting evidence. If it doesn't say, if it just says resistance to social influence, use either or both. So in Milgram's study, in one condition, he had more than one participant in the room, or confederates in the room, that were acting as teachers, and they refused to obey the authority figure. And then the obedience levels dropped to 10%. So if somebody else in the room refused to continue the electric shocks, then they definitely did not. But then you can criticise both of those and say that it comes from lab experiments, therefore lacks ecological validity. So in the case of someone refusing to follow orders in the army or something, just because they refused a Milgram study, it doesn't mean you can explain real life situations where individuals obey or individuals conform. Locus of control. So Rotter talks about individuals who feel that they are in control of their behaviour and their fate. So those who have an internal locus of control, and make sure you say internal. Sometimes people keep saying these high levels of locus of control or something. It's not about high levels, it's about having a strong internal. So internal and external are the key words. So people with a strong internal locus of control or a high internal locus of control feel that they are in control of their behaviour. They take responsibility for their actions. They're more autonomous and independent in their decisions, so therefore they're less likely to be obedient. Someone who has an external locus of control is likely to follow the orders of an authority figure because they happily put their fate in the hands of others and are influenced by events outside of their control. So, aka the orders of an authority figure, what the rest of the group are doing. Is there support for this explanation? So, this idea of self-efficacy. So, if somebody has high levels of self-efficacy, that means that they believe they can make a change. So, it's about like having confidence in one's ability to make a change in society. So, if someone has a high levels of self-efficacy, then they're likely to resist authority because they believe that there's like a greater purpose that they're aiming to achieve. Another point that you could use here, which I think it might be easier to say than this one actually, is you could use the agentic state argument as supporting evidence, and you can say that support for this explanation of locus of control comes from agentic state. People with an internal locus of control are much more likely to maintain the autonomous state, and people who have an external locus of control are much more likely to experience the agentic shift and go into the agentic state. And so you could say, therefore, it provides credibility to the explanation as it's clear why individuals with an external, this case you're saying it's much more clear why individuals with an internal locus of control are able to resist authority, because it's because they've maintained that autonomous state. Lack of support for the explanation. So counter evidence comes from twenge. Americans have become more resistant over time, but also more external. So therefore it weakens the suggestion that there's a link between the two, because how can a population be becoming more resistant and more external at the same time? You would expect one of them to be the opposite way around. So there can't be a clear link. Which one is stronger? So situational or dispositional again. So situational, clear evidence from AQA study that environmental variables such as unanimity affect whether they can resist. So this one's like the social support explanation stronger because there's supporting evidence coming from studies. Dispositional is stronger because even in situations where there was a dissenter, some people still obeyed or still conformed. So therefore, it can't be the only reason. The situation can't be the be all and end all factor. There must be other influences. Minority influence. So Moscovici is your key psychologist here. So he's talking about minorities. Can minorities have an influence on a group? And if they're going to be successful, they need to follow these three principles. So consistency, so maintaining the same message, repetition of the same message over and over again. Flexibility, it's about negotiations, it's about compromise, it's about meeting them in the middle. And then commitment, it's about making some kind of sacrifice to show that they are strongly invested in the cause. And then you need to be able to give different examples of each one, or often you were given a stem where you have to give them. So consistency, just say like what the message is and what they're repeating. So if it was like the teacher strikes, you could say consistently teachers keep repeating the same message, they keep giving out leaflets and flyers and maintaining their stance about the importance of fully funding education to the government. They're flexible in they're negotiating with the government about what percentage pay rise and the idea that they're not being completely unreasonable because they're asking for funding for children. No, it's important. But yeah, the idea they're making negotiations with the government and willing to kind of reduce on their original offer. And then commitment, the idea they're making sacrifices, they're not paid when they go on strike, to show that they think it's a very important cause. Is there evidence to support these principles? So yes, so Moscovici did a rerun of Ash's experiment, but in reverse. So as in the idea was that there was the Confederates were the minority. So 2 Confederates, 4 genuine, and the 2 Confederates kept saying that the slides that they were looking at, the images they were looking at, were blue when they were actually green. But if the 2 Confederates maintained consistency, so they kept saying that they were blue when they were green or whatever, then that actually influenced the 4 genuine participants. And you can see here the percentage of responses. But then the key issue here is it lacks mundane realism. When are you ever asked to look at colours and say whether they're blue or green? Like, it's not really applicable to real life situations such as kind of whole societal change. So therefore, the study lacks external validity and potentially usefulness if it can't explain real life social change. Are these principles useful? Yes, they provide small groups of activists with a guide of how to effectively influence the majority in society. So we, as teachers, know that we need to be flexible. We know that we need to show commitment levels. We can't just keep saying we want funding for education and not go on strike to demonstrate how committed we are to the cause, etc. The principles are conflicting. So principles of consistency and flexibility obviously contradict each other. It's unclear how you can make a compromise without appearing inconsistent in your views. Yeah. And then also the discussion points that we're going to move on to in a second are relevant here. So social change. Moscovici again talks about the 4 stages of the social change process. So drawing attention to an issue, so getting media coverage, getting people to listen to what the issues are. Consistency, maintaining the same message, repeating the same message. Augmentation principle, making a sacrifice, showing your commitment. And then the snowball effect, the idea that it gathers momentum, it gathers support, and then it reaches a tipping point, and then real change is created. Is there evidence to support the process? You can use Moscovici as supporting evidence, particularly for the consistency variable. You can use some real life examples as well. Here we've got Z's research. It showed that if the minority reached just 10% of the population, social change would occur, and use the Black Civil Rights Movement to support this claim. and you can use other examples of social movements that are here as well. So like LGBTQ plus activists, by being flexible, environmentalists by being consistent, suffragettes by being committed to their cause. So lots of different examples of groups who have gone through this process and achieved social change by doing those things. So if you don't want to use these points, there's plenty of others. But then the against is that a minority can't achieve social change whilst they're still a minority, because because of the explanations of normative social influence. So Dutton and Gerard refer to normative social influence, and a snowball effect would not result from a minority. Individuals look to the majority in society because they believe they're correct or because they want to fit in. So people wouldn't show their support for a cause if it wasn't the majority of society, because that doesn't fit with the reasons why people do conform to others. Also, it raises the question, this piece of these principles and research into this area raises the question of what level of commitment is the most effective. So Mass is saying that if a minority shows selfless commitment through acts of sacrifice, then they will succeed. And then you can give an example of, hunger strikes, etc. So showing that commitment is significant and it does help cause social change, it does help facilitate that. But then Bashir is saying that often when social groups show high levels of commitment, it can be perceived in a negative way, and then other members of society view them as too extreme and too radical, and therefore dismiss their views. So, for example, the feminists, sorry, I could hear something weird then. Feminists are seen as man haters if they're more radical in their views, or at the moment, the Stop the Oil have been sort of disrupting trains, disrupting traffic, disrupting the snooker, football games, that kind of thing, and people often dismiss what their actual views are and just see them as in a negative way, because and then more focus on the actions that they're taking rather than listening to what their actual views are. So overall, you could say that it's unclear in terms of the research that's been done on it. It's unclear about how committed a group should be in order to achieve social change. So therefore not that helpful, or more research needs to be done. And that is it.